I'm Ken Coleman, Director of the Center for Political Studies here at ISR. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Miller Converse Lecture. We have an absolutely terrific speaker and scholar here to celebrate this occasion. When I wrote to Henry asking him if he would do it, I noted to him that it was long overdue. Nancy Burns will introduce Henry here in a moment. This occasion celebrates the careers of Warren Miller and Phil Converse, two giants on the stages of social sciences and of this institution, the ISR. It's helpful, I think, to step back sometimes and recall the impact that the behavioral revolution had on the social sciences, especially on political science, social psychology, sociology, and public economics. Warren and Phil were, of course, key players in that revolution. Rigorous study of human behavior using techniques for data gathering based on statistical sampling, and tested and evaluated measurements of concepts. These were the hallmarks of the behavioral revolution. Today, we take it for granted that one can use scientific standards to study human behavior, at least we in this room and we in this building. Today, we take it for granted, but when Warren and Phil were young scholars, it was revolutionary. It was upsetting to the status quo among their peers and the older generation of scholars, and it was genuinely avant-garde. Warren and Phil not only adopted new techniques of study of human behavior, but they honed them and advanced them. And they did so on the study of mass politics and representation. Their methods, their concepts, and their findings are still used by social scientists all over the world. It is so prevalent that one forgets just how rare it is for ideas to survive 60 years and more, such that graduate students still test their ideas and we debate the ideas, and we try new ways to measure their concepts and the relationships among the factors that they identified. Just recently, I read an article by a Korean scholar studying party systems in East Asia, using the concept of the normal vote, and citing Phil and Warren and other co-authors. So ho-hum, cite something from 1960, and not just as a nod to it, but really engage with it. Build on it and apply it today to contemporary data. And of course, Warren and Phil were two of the founders of this place, the building we're in, and several of the centers in ISR, the ICPSR and our own CPS. Miller is the example we often give of the institution builder, and Converse, the example we often give of the idea generator. They both were, of course, spawning multiple new areas of inquiry, spanning multiple disciplines. Both of them not hemmed in by academic boundaries or geographic boundaries. They researched the United States and other parts of the world. Research borrowing methods from other areas of science, but also working closely with colleagues in the other social sciences. One thing has always struck me about the work of Warren and Phil, and it's exemplified in a paper that I read recently that Warren wrote very late in his life. In the paper, he makes an important point about partisanship across several countries, and he makes his point using crosstabs. Just show the data. Readers would understand. The key was that he had prepared up to that point with careful measurement and clear writing about the concept and the relationship to measurement, and having a trust with his readers that if he just showed things in the right way, they would understand, as he did, what was going on with the data. And his trust paid off, because even someone like me understood exactly what he was getting at, and it was a terrific paper. I think of our speakers somewhat in the same vein. Clear, understandable, appropriate methods, and subtly sophisticated, but without pretension. So Nancy Burns will introduce our speaker.
Trying to decide when I was sitting down, is this for the tall people? This is for me? I don't know. So I'm really thrilled to introduce Henry Brady today. He is Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy and class of 1941 Monroe Deutsch Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of California. He's a former director of the Survey Research Center at Berkeley, and as you all know, Henry has made huge contributions in a variety of fields. His early work on scaling put multidimensional scaling into a statistical framework. His early work was also centered on questions of how primary election voters make choices in low information environments and the role of strategic issues in that decision. Henry took advantage of new technology, computer-assisted telephone interviewing, newish in 1990, to study the effect of emerging issues in elections and changes over the course of an electoral campaign. He was one of the first scholars to work with the rolling cross-section design and take good advantage of that design by using techniques that allowed for almost overnight changes in parts of the survey instrument. In work that's especially near and dear to my heart, work with Sid Verba and Kay Schlossman, he's done field-shifting studies of American political participation. He did innovative survey research in the former Soviet Union, providing a view of the dynamics of voting in the post-Soviet transition. And he's also worked to marry the best parts of qualitative and quantitative analysis. The Goldman School and the Survey Research Center at Berkeley aren't the first institutions that Henry worked to build up. He was a central figure in the creation of the Society for Political Methodology, helping to secure grant funding for the first 2 political methodology summer conferences. And he's a past recipient of the Society's Career Achievement Award. He's past president of the American Political Science Association, past president of the Political Methodology Society of the American Political Science Association. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and that's a lot. But if you say Henry Brady to me and ask me what first comes to mind, I'm afraid that these many spectacular institution and discipline-building contributions do come to mind, but they come to mind after something else. In the fall of 1986, I had the great good fortune to take Henry's graduate class in quantitative methods. And so, what comes to mind for me first then is not all of these spectacular, fabulous contributions, but instead, the time he started class with his own performance of Capital Steps lyrics put to the music of the Beach Boys song, Barbara Ann. Yeah. Best I could tell. The choreography was his own. And so maybe he's got something along that line in store for us today. So I'm going to turn things over to Henry, knowing that your talk is going to be thought-provoking and insightful, and hoping that it will also involve song and dance. So there it is.
Nancy Burns is a treasure, and you're lucky to have her at Michigan. She is just an extraordinary person. I remember her as a graduate student, and I remember Sid Verba and Kay Schlossman and I just being amazed at her energy, and it has not abated. She continues to have spectacular energy and to get things done and to be really just an amazing person. It's really nice to be here at what I consider the cathedral, and I mean that, the cathedral of American social science. This is the place that's done more great things than any other place, and it's a place that's done things big in important ways. There's a magic formula here. I'm not sure what it is, but somehow this is the place that can do big things and really do stuff that illuminates the way the world works in really fundamental ways. I just spent some time with the graduate students, a group of them today, and wow, what a wonderful, I could have gone for hours. It's just fascinating hearing them talk and finding out what they're up to. So this place continues to be just an amazing and wonderful place. I also am happy to hear, by the way, that the provost here at Michigan apparently is capable of changing something like the time when events occur. And I'd like to know that magic formula too, because as dean,
hasn't happened yet.
You know, I say things, and as Dwight Eisenhower once, what Harry Truman said about Dwight Eisenhower, he'll say do this, do that, and nothing will happen. And that's what my experience is as a dean all too often. But apparently the provost at Michigan knows how to make things happen. So it'll be interesting to follow this out. Okay, I want to talk about changing cleavages and coalitions in American politics. The goals of the talk are to describe changes over time in electoral coalitions. So a lot of time is going to be spent on that, because I don't think you can understand the current moment without understanding how we got here. sheds light on the structure of American politics today. By the way, I'm going to use a lot of crosstabs because I'm with Warren Miller. Often, if you can't show it in a crosstab, it probably doesn't exist. Provide some insight into Trump supporters. I actually, before the election, was going around giving talks to people, especially in Berkeley, trying to explain to them. It was like explaining to people from about some foreigner who was running for president and how they should be thinking about Trump supporters. I want to emphasize the importance of sociological factors and link sociological ideas with attitudinal explanations of voting. A lot of survey work focuses on attitudinal and issue dimensions of politics. That's important, but I think we sometimes neglect the sociological factors, and I'm going to try to make the argument that we need to focus a little bit more on them and understand what's going on. Okay, first thoughts about Phil Converse and Warren Miller. It's a tremendous honor to give a lecture that's named after these two amazing people. When I was a graduate student, we all learned the incantation, which was Campbell, Converse, Miller, Stokes. Angus Campbell was another member of the team here at Michigan. Don Stokes was here as well. Don Stokes went off and did something foolish like becoming a dean. But it was Phil and Warren who actually stayed very centrally involved in the discipline and made enormous contributions. I was lucky enough to get to know them both. Phil generously gave me permission to title, somewhat presumptuously, one of my first papers, The Nature of Utility Functions in Mass Publics. He has a famous paper called The Nature of Belief Systems in Mass Publics. I just looked on Google Scholar. That paper, although written in 1964, has 8,500 citations. My paper has 100. So you're looking at somebody who is 1/85th of Phil Converse. That's pretty good. I'll take it. Warren guided my efforts to develop questions on viability and electability in primaries in the 1984 American National Election Study, where we started to do stuff with rolling cross-sections and other things. They were just both the intellectual giants who did amazing things. And I'm really pleased to say that I knew both of them and that they were helpful to me in my career in various ways. So it is a tremendous honor to be here. Okay, let's start with a prologue. Images of American political parties. So Democrats. I think things that come to mind are, it's the party of the 1932 FDR coalition, the New Deal realignment. Since at least then we have the notion that they're working class folks and union members. More recently, the party of Bill Clinton that changed things somewhat, New Democrats and so forth. But we think of Democrats as being lower income and lower education. And important figures are FDR, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, Clinton. Republicans. We think of I think of them as the party of the 1896 William McKinley and Mark Hanna business realignment. And I think that's generally right. There's Theodore Roosevelt in there, but he was really a maverick and an exception to what became the route through Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, and onward. And since at least then we've thought of the Republicans as the party of the upper class and business. More recently, Ronald Reagan, conservative. Higher income, higher income and higher education, it should say. Higher income and higher education. So we really have quite different images of the two parties. And what I want to explore is whether that's still true. So here is the Democratic vote and education in November 2016 using the 2016 American National Election Study post-election survey. And what you immediately note is the Clinton voters were more highly educated. Despite our images of what the Democratic Party is about, it turns out the Clinton voters were more highly educated. And this next picture is just the mirror image of that, because this is the percent of the two-party vote for Trump. And so Trump voters less educated. So that's a big surprise. This may not be a surprise. The Republican vote in religious attendance, the percent of the two-party vote for Trump, as religious attendance goes from never attend to essentially weekly attendance, you get more Trump voters. So that may not be a surprise given what we have learned about the Republican Party in the last 20 or 30 years. But I'm going to show you that that's actually a recent thing, that religious attenders are more likely to be Republicans. Okay, and then this is something that, since I'm a higher education administrator, that has been very intriguing to me, and that is the growing Republican distrust of higher education. What's going on there? So these are data from the Pew surveys, and what they show is on the left among Republicans and lean Republicans that suddenly there's been a long-term trend of decreasing trust for higher education, but it just really took a nosedive starting in 2015. And at the same time, Democrats have become more and more trusting of higher education. What's going on? Okay, so first let me just explain a little bit about how to, at least I try to understand American politics. My grandfather was a carpenter on the New York City stage, and when you would ask him about the musical comedies he worked on, and you'd say, what were they about? He would immediately launch into a description of the scenery he had built. So I hope I get to the actual plot of the musical comedy that we are now experiencing. But I'm going to first start with describing the scenery in honor of my grandfather, who could, by the way, tell you down to the last screw exactly what he had done. And when you would ask him, by the way, what was the plot of Oklahoma, he'd go, cowboys? So this is one way I think of American politics. Start with sociological characteristics. Why do that? Well, I think that they often describe very fundamental aspects of our lives. Education, income, religious attendance, ethnicity. These are really important things. And that we've got to have a better understanding of how they're related to people's political views. So a very simple model is take two dimensions, and for the moment I'm going to put race and ethnicity aside. I'm going to split the data up eventually and look at non-Hispanic whites mostly, because those are the folks I'm most interested in right now. And I will talk a little bit about Hispanics and non-white, that group, which is the rest of the electorate. But right now, I'm going to not talk much about race or ethnicity. I'm going to just talk about two things: socioeconomic status and religious attendance. And then try to understand political outcomes based upon those things. So here, just to show you why socioeconomic status makes sense, here's a very simple cross-tabulation, and you'll see this again and again in this talk, these kinds of tabulations, where I take 5 educational quintiles. So I break the electorate into 5 levels of education, and I break the electorate into 5 levels of income. And this crosstab shows you what percentage are in each of the 25 boxes, 5 times 5, that come up. And what you notice, first of all, is that along the diagonal you get the biggest numbers. It's about 1/3 of the total sample along the diagonal. That means they're highly correlated with one another. And furthermore, all the numbers going down get bigger, and coming in from the sides, they get bigger. So basically, this is something that's highly correlated, two quantities. They're correlated, by the way, at about 0.4. About 16% of the variance is explained one by the other. And so this shows you that, in fact, maybe it makes a lot of sense to think about socioeconomic status as the master variable. And I have to admit, I've written now 2 books, one of which was just published a few days ago, in which we've used socioeconomic status as a master variable. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to start telling you why that was, I don't think, a mistake for those books, but maybe something we better rethink for the future. But for the moment, let's stick with it. The other thing I want to show you is religious attendance and socioeconomic status. And here, by the way, is a classic example of no correlation. Surprises people often, but it's true. And basically what that means is here, since these are not quintiles of attend religious services, they're different levels. So across all of the American National Election Studies from 52 to 2012, about 37% were in the weekly attendance category, and about 22% in the never, and then in between. And the net result is that what we find is across the rows we get essentially constant numbers. That means that basically these two things are not correlated with one another, which, by the way, makes religious attendance an interesting way to have another dimension of looking at American politics, because it is uncorrelated with socioeconomic status. Okay, so here's another tool, a spatial model. This comes from a paper that I published in 2002 called Trust the People, and it was on the 2000 election. And what this does is it takes religious attendance, in this case times per year, and then in the bottom, household income. So it's basically socioeconomic status along the horizontal axis, it's religious attendance along the vertical axis. And it takes a whole bunch of groups in American politics, fundamentalist Christians, African Americans, Hispanics, blue-collar workers, and so forth, and locates them in terms of their average person in that group, in terms of the amount of religious attendance and the income that they have. So, for example, fundamentalist Christians are low income but very high religious attendance. The managers there are very high income but low religious attendance, and on and on. And by the way, the mnemonic here is the Democrats are triangles because they're pointy-headed, and the Republicans are squares. Just leave it at that. You can reflect upon whether those are good mnemonic devices for various groups. But what we do is, so for each group, we decide we look and see whether they voted on balance for the Republicans or the Democrats. And then we put an amoeba-like shaped thing around that to show you what the coalition looks like for Democrats and Republicans. Now, as we all know, American political parties are capacious tents, and therefore these amoebas are rather large. And so that's worth knowing. And it's also interesting to see which groups are in and which groups are out, and which groups are on the borders. Okay. Another way to look at American politics is an issues model of political outcomes. So here I'm going to choose economic issues and social moral issues. Study after study has shown that these are the two major dimensions of American politics. It's economics and it's social issues or social moral or cultural issues. And then we get another diagram. And it's the same thing, except now we've got economic conservatism scale along the bottom, and we have a moral conservatism along the vertical. Now, we do that partly because there's good reason to believe economic conservatism is related to income, and that moral conservatism is related to religious attendance. So we get this picture. Then the next thing we do is we ask, where's the political cleavage? And what is the line that cleaves the election into partisan camps? And so this line shows you that it's about here, and that tells you several things. Perhaps the most important is it's not a vertical line. If it were a vertical line, then only economic conservatism would matter, whether you're on the left or the right on that. If it were a horizontal line, it would mean that only social moral conservatism mattered. It's neither of that. It's a diagonal line. That means both dimensions matter in American politics, that people's votes are determined both by their economic conservatism and their social moral conservatism or liberality. And then we put the two diagrams together. And what's interesting here, by the way, is to see how, as you go from sociological characteristics to the attitudinal or issue characteristics, that the cleavage lines sort of rotate. And one of the most interesting groups is fundamentalist Christians, who become very conservative economically, even though they have low income. But there's lots of other interesting stories in here. And in fact, there's a whole talk that we could be given on what's going on here. But this shows you that each method probably tells you something important and interesting about American politics. It also makes you wonder about what the relationship is between the two approaches. And that's something that we probably, as political scientists, need to even look at more and more. Okay, and then I add this picture because I love it. This is a Calder print, and that I got permission to put this in one of my articles, and it was almost impossible to get permission, but you might notice that we're using the standard color coding. The Democrats are blue and Republicans are red, and that's what they use on election night. And as everybody knows, the reason they chose blue for the Democrats was because red would be too true to type. This is an older crowd, so I guess you get that. Younger crowds may not know what I'm talking about. But anyway, but look at those pictures, and now look at the Calder print. I had no idea that Sandy Calder, Alexander Calder, was a political scientist, but apparently he was. And he had anticipated the cleavage structure of American politics. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to take a bunch of data from the General Social Survey, which is done at the University of Chicago, NORC. That's been done since 1972 until 2016. And then a study that's been done here forever, the American National Election Studies. This is the study, of course, that Warren Miller and Phil Converse had an enormous amount to do with. They launched it and nurtured it, and Warren eventually made it a sort of national treasure by getting a whole group that was a council that oversaw it and everything else. So I'm going to use this. The cumulative is only out till 2012, so I'm just using the cumulative till 2012. And then I'm using two studies of the 2016 election, the American National Election Studies 2016 pilot study. This is great because it was done in January 2016. And as a result, you can actually see really strong Trump voters because people who identified with Trump then, it was prior to him becoming the Republican nominee. And in fact, at a time when not many people thought he would be. So that's really great to really identify the characteristics of real Trump supporters. And then the American National Election Study 2016 pre and post election study. Okay, so let me just make a comment on SES and demographic variables. I'm going to use religious attendance, education and income, and then I'm going to split the samples up by race and ethnicity. There's other things I could look at and I think should be looked at. I actually wanted to bring you results about occupation, but I foundered on the fact that the codes have not been provided for some of the more recent years, and also just the general complexity of occupational classifications. But I want to look more at that because I think occupation is an important sociological characteristic. I think urbanism and region is probably really important. I think age and gender and other things are probably less important. But these are things that are left undone. Okay, Act 1. So now we've built the scenery. Now we can talk, hopefully, about the plot. I'm first going to talk about the rise of the religious political cleavage in American politics. Okay, so this is this model again, and I'm going to look at religious attendance and socioeconomic status. Let me explain how I've constructed my tables. And just take my word for it. I think it'll become clear what's going on, but let me try to explain it quickly. I'm considering all American National Election Studies data from 1952 to 2012, 16 presidential elections. I split it up into 4 periods of 4 elections apiece. So 52 to 64, 68 to 80, and so forth. I consider it 20 groups, the 4 religious attendance groups times the 5 socioeconomic status groups. That's 20 groups. For each period and for each group, calculate the average Republican share of the two-party vote and see if it was less than or exceeded the average Republican share for that period. In effect, what I'm trying to do for those interested in technical matters is I'm putting a fixed effects in here. I'm trying to adjust for the fact that we have swings. I'm trying to actually get back to the normal vote is maybe one way to say it, to use a good Michigan term. And actually, I did it a little more sophisticatedly than I've described it here. Then let me just show you the table. So then I get these tables. I put a D or an R, and then I put an R or a D with parentheses around it if the degree to which the Republican vote by that group was 4 percentage points or less. So in other words, it wasn't a big margin. And I do the same thing for Democrats if it was 4 percentage points or less. So then what I do is I look for where we've got the R's. I could do the D's, but I do the R's. And I shade them and show you what's happened over time. So the first one in the upper left-hand corner is for the first period, 1952 to 1964. And then the next period is 1968 to 1980. That's bottom left, and so forth. And what you might notice is these R's are moving around in interesting ways. And in fact, specifically, we can put lines of cleavage on these, and it turns out there's a technical way to do this. This is what's called a support vector problem, and I'm mentioning that just so that my data science bona fides have now been proven, and because that's a modern technique that data scientists use. This is really a discrimination problem or a discriminant problem or something like that. And you can actually get it from what are these numbers, but I'm not going to go into details about that. Trust me that this is the right place to put these cleavage lines by and large. And you notice they go in different places for different years. And let's take all 4 periods and notice what's happened with the cleavage. So in the early period, it's a vertical line basically. What does that mean? That means in the early period, SES mattered, but attendance at church did not matter in terms of the vote. There was no difference between the Democrats and the Republicans on that dimension. Notice then it starts tilting leftward. falling down, if you will, and it falls down more and more until by the very end, we get basically a very diagonal line which says that what mattered was both SES. Higher SES is more likely to be Republican because we are in the upper right-hand corner, we get the Republicans, that's higher socioeconomic status, and attendance at church matters. So both matter. So
These are whites, right?
pardon me?
These are whites.
These are actually the whole sample. In a minute, I'm going to go to, actually for this, I won't go to non-Hispanic whites because for this cleavage, it doesn't matter that much, it turns out. But yes. And then, by the way, I just got worried, well, is this really real? So I went to the GSS. It's got a better measure of attending church services. It's an 8-point scale. And it really becomes clear here. This is the last period, 2012, and you can really see this cleavage line. And that it really is the case that we've got a new cleavage in American politics that's developed in the last 30 or 40 years, and it has to do with religious attendance. Okay, now here's another way to get at it. I take yearly regressions, a technique to try to figure out what the impact of something is on something else, at least descriptively. Yearly regressions for each election of Republican share of the two-party vote adjusted for election average, fixed effects, on religious attendance and SES Quintiles. And then I get the regression coefficients, which turn out to be percentages, basically, of how much the Republicans are advantaged or disadvantaged by increases in SES. So the red line shows you that basically a 1 unit increase in SES, remember these are quintiles, so that's going up from the bottom of the heap to the 20th point or the 40th or 60th or 80th or whatever. A 1 unit increase in SES leads to about a 4 to 5% increase in Republican vote. That's pretty significant. 1 unit SES, 4 or 5% more Republican. Now look at the green line. So this is over time, and what we see is initially, and this is just proving what I showed you before, basically, initially, religious attendance had no impact on the vote. Basically, those green dots and that line are near zero, and then it's just skyrocketed up over time. Till now, it looks like, if anything, religious attendance has a bigger impact on the Republican vote. A 1 unit increase in religious attendance, remember it's a 4 unit scale, leads to about a 6% increase in Republican vote. It's a pretty significant effect. Okay, so what have we found? Well, we found out that the linkage between socioeconomic status and political outcome appears stable, 4 to 5%. But the linkage between religious attendance and political outcome has changed dramatically over time. Okay, so what's happening? How do we explain this? Well, this is a simplified Michigan funnel of causality model, which anybody at Michigan is taught, which is basically the factors that lead to a vote choice. And issues are in there. There's lots of other stuff, but issues are certainly in there. And the question is, what's going on? We get changes between the left-hand side and the right-hand side, but do issues have any role in that? Well, I think so. I think that these linkages, by the way, on the left-hand side, the linkage between your SES and your position on these issues actually doesn't change that much over time. It changes somewhat, but not a lot. Those are pretty stable. What does seem to change a lot is your relationship between political outcome, your vote choice, for example, and the issues. Now, I don't think that's the issues affecting the outcome. It actually goes both ways. There's a circular flow of causality because it's entrepreneurs who come along and talk about the issue. And then, by the way, this just shows you, this shows you that if we did a regression of Republican two-party vote on pro-life abortion and government help others scales, pro-life abortion is a scale that measures your feelings about abortion, and government help others is 2 items on the American National Election Studies having to do with government guaranteed jobs and aid to blacks. You find out that over time, the impact of the issues having to do with economics, the government help, are about a 4%, well, actually these are beta weights, so they're not easily interpretable, but it's pretty constant. And yet the impact of abortion has changed over time. So that suggests that religious attendance which is correlated with abortion opinion, is mediated by the issue position you have on abortion that leads to your vote. Okay, and then I checked it with the GSS data, and we get the same picture, sort of amazingly, over that same period. So, and I'm going to skip all these because I don't have that much time, but I want to tell you what happened here, why this change. Well, I think it's an interaction of social movements, elite actions, and sociological factors. So, the civil rights movement in the South meant that a formerly solid Democratic South started to think about becoming Republicans. So it was initiated by the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 solidified that notion. Remember Lyndon Johnson's famous comment, "We've lost the South for a generation." He was actually wrong. The Democratic Party has lost the South for generations, it looks like. Then there was Roe versus Wade in 1973, the famous abortion decision. There was Nixon's Southern strategy, which made use of Roe versus Wade to try to appeal to Southern voters. And then there's the distribution of religious denominations. Here's religious denominations in America. The red are Baptists, Southern Baptists. The green are Methodists, a little bit to the north of them. And then way north in Minnesota and so forth is evangelical Lutherans. Then there's Mormons, which are the gray, and the rest are counties where it's mostly Catholics. What happened in this realignment is this, is the Southern Baptists, if you go back and look at the ANES data, were Democrats before 64, 65, 67, 68. The Methodists and the evangelical Lutherans were Republicans. And they didn't have much truck or trade with one another politically. Then along came the Civil Rights Revolution, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, Roe versus Wade, the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, and the South starts to think about going Republican, and suddenly the Baptists and the Methodists and other fundamentalists realize they have things in common. Their opposition to abortion, for example. And therefore, you suddenly see a shift in the vote on the part of the Southern Baptists towards the Republicans. And you get the coalition we now have, which is that these groups are Republican and pretty solidly against abortion. And it was the issue and the interaction of all those factors that led to that. And that's why we now see religious attendance having such a big impact on American politics. And I love that map. It's data from 2010, but the distributions haven't changed that remarkably over the last 30 or 40 years. And it's the only one I can find. Okay, so there's one thing that's happened. Now that does not explain Donald Trump, though. It sort of indirectly does, because in the end, Donald Trump needed those groups to get elected president, and they went along with him thinking he was the better option with respect to the abortion issue than Hillary Clinton. But that doesn't really explain him. So what explains Donald Trump's rise? Well, let's go back to this diagram. Remember I said income and education are correlated with one another. Might as well look at them together with socioeconomic status. Well, here's some diagrams that look at cleavage structures where we look at education and income. So this is like what I did before, except now I'm taking 5 education quintiles and 5 income quintiles, and I'm looking at where the cleavages were over time. And if you notice, that line, it used to be that Republicans were the party of those with high education. And now we see increasingly we get to a situation where Republicans are both high education and high income, high education and high income. And then in this last period, something odd happens. This line starts having a reverse slope. And what that means is it starts becoming the case that actually it's the Democrats who are the people with high education. Okay, this is how those slopes have changed over time. The red arrow shows you the side the Republicans are on, and this shows you over time how those slopes have changed. All I've done is take those cleavage lines and put them on one diagram so you can see the rotation. And then I'm going to skip this because this just proves that more detailed analysis gives you the same result. Now let's look at non-Hispanic whites. So all heretofore, I've just been looking at everybody. Now I'm going to break it down, and now notice what happens with those lines. They're really rotating. And in fact, here's the rotation diagram. And just as a comparison, we can go back and forth. This, the new one, old one. This is like the optometry shot. The new one, which do you prefer? You see? So basically what's been driving this in the entire sample is non-Hispanic whites. And in fact, I'll show you at the very end a chart that shows you this is not happening among the people who are Hispanic and non-white. They are still in a situation where the Republicans are the party of the high income, high education, and the Democrats are the party of the low income, low education, which is the image we have of the Democratic Party. The important thing here is we got to change our image of what the Democratic Party is. It's not what it once was. And then this just shows you some regressions, and actually what I want to show you here is there's a bigger effect for religious attendance among non-Hispanic whites. There's a bigger effect for education among non-Hispanic whites, and a somewhat smaller effect for income. By the way, these two lines crossing is what's happening. Is it used to be that education was the master SES variable, and now it's income is more of a master variable. They've crossed one another, and the parties have shifted in their composition and so forth. Okay, here's another way to get at it, which I rather like. For white non-Hispanics, take your income quintile minus your education quintile. Think of that as people whose income is bigger than you'd expect given their education. So a positive number means you sort of got an excess of income over education. A negative number means you've got an excess of education over income. And what you find is the Democrats were the party of voters, which can never happen, of course, but Democrats once party of voters whose income exceeded their education. Now it's the Republicans whose income exceeds their education. These are folks, I think, and I think some other data I'll show you in a few moments, show that these are folks who feel resentment over the fact that there's these highly educated coastal elites who seem to get these high-paying jobs. And of course, it's also the minorities, and it's also all sorts of other groups that they're not really very happy about getting these jobs just because they have education. And they've gone out with very little education, and they've been able to build a life and get high income, and they've done that through dint of hard work and hard effort. And there's a point to be made here. It's not completely wrong either. They are to be admired for what they've accomplished. Okay, so what's happening? Well, now we've got cross-cutting cleavages that both parties have to deal with. And this chart just sort of summarizes things. And the important things here is what I've circled, which is that the income level now, that for Democrats, you have a situation where higher income leads people to be pro-choice and bigger government. It's not a big effect, but it's somewhat of an effect. But it's really educated, more educated, college or more that you get for Democrats being pro-choice. So the Republicans now have folks who are less educated. Higher income Democrats are the folks who are going to be this way. So these are the social issues. Let me explain what I'm doing here. The social issues here, on these, you get this result. And on the economic issues, you get this result where lower income people are, in fact, in favor of Democrats' economic policies that would redistribute income or help poor people. But on social issues, it's higher income people who are in favor of the social issue positions of the Democrats, abortion, gay rights, and so forth. And lower income people are in favor of the Republicans' perspectives on that. So this is a problem both parties have to deal with. I'm going to argue it's more of a problem for the Democrats than the Republicans. So let me go through that. On social issues, such as abortion, homosexual rights, gender equity, and others, they appeal to highly educated white voters, but not to those white voters with less education and often lower income. This splits both coalitions, but the Republicans benefit in these ways. Higher income Republicans do not care much about these issues, the social issues. Steve Forbes, when he ran for president, started with being pro-choice and it pretty soon jettisoned that to talk about tax cuts. And every problem would be solved by tax cuts. And that's what higher income Republicans care about. Lower income Republicans are often Christian fundamentalists, evangelicals, Pentecostals, etc., who care a lot about these issues and who also seem to preach a gospel of self-reliance that rejects government involvement. And I think that's one reason why you saw in that real early picture that the Christian fundamentalists were conservative on economic issues. And so they go to church and they get the gospel of self-reliance and are told they should be conservative on economic issues. Now let's go to economic issues, such as government spending, government guaranteed jobs, or health care. These all appeal to lower income voters, for sure, in the data. But they often get mixed up with race in ways that cause lower educated and often lower income voters to reject them. Education makes you more tolerant. Less education, you're probably less tolerant. And therefore, you may be unhappy about the fact that, yes, Obamacare, yeah, it may help you, but it's mostly going to help those other people if you're white, non-Hispanic. And so therefore, they reject those ideas and are willing to listen to appeals to reject them. So Democrats have a real problem in terms of convincing people that their agenda, like Obamacare, is really something that would help folks in terms of their income and well-being, because it gets mixed up with race and other things. Here's my parts of the Republican Party. Right now, I'd split it up into 4 areas. There's the white Christian fundamentalists, there's the traditional conservatives. By the way, traditional conservatives are high income and high education. Think of the Bushes, for example. That'd be a premier example. The libertarians, and then the populist right, which is the Donald Trump new group that's come in. Okay, so I just have a few minutes, so I'm going to just talk very quickly about the election of Donald Trump. Here's that diagram again, but I add 2016. Look what's happened in 2016. Now, this may be just one election, because everything else here, remember, was an average over 4 elections, and so maybe this is a bit deviating. But it looks like this has really rotated even more. So that now, in fact, the Democrats are the party of high education. In fact, they look a lot like the Republicans did in 52 through 56. Republicans used to be the party, remember, of high education, and now Democrats look that way. That's a big change. And then here's another way to get at it. Here's white non-Hispanics, January 2016, the pilot study. Let's take that difference between income and education. Look at, in the first column, the percent of the group with income quintile, which is greater than education quintile. This is the people who I argued felt resentment. 48% of the people who said they were for Trump are in that category. Only 21% of those who said they were for Clinton. Now, as I said, I like this survey because you can get it sort of pure, fundamental Trump support. That's the big change or difference between the two parties now. And then going to 2016, you still get a big difference, 38.9% versus 25% for Clinton. So it persists into the general election, although now you've got people voting for Trump because they're high religious tenders, Christian fundamentalists, and they figure that Trump's better than Clinton, although they may not love Trump. And you still get this result. And then let me just go to one of these. Identity as an American. Trump supporters see American identity as very important. This is, again, the 2016 pilot study, and shows that, unlike everybody else, their identity as an American is really a fundamental thing. And this is related to the kinds of issues I think having to do with the fact that Trump voters are seeing the highly educated as having an identity of their own, which is called education. And they have a real identity, which is called being an American. And the pointy-headed liberals don't get how important it is to be an American. Okay, the future. Will the Democrats be able to find a breakthrough economic issue that focuses on income concerns? That would be their breakthrough. They didn't do it with Obamacare. Will the Republicans be able to continue to hold together a coalition of those concerned with moral social conservatism and economic conservatism? Well, to the extent that they keep giving the higher income members of the party tax cuts and give the social moral conservatism people judges on the Supreme Court, maybe so. And will the changing demographics of the country make the difference for the Democrats? Okay, so that's the thing. I'm talking about white non-Hispanics. But it turns out they're getting smaller as a proportion of the total population. And I don't have time to explain the complexities of this because it turns out that these groups, which are non-white and Hispanic, the rest of the electorate, all vote Democratic, basically. But this still can get you at the cleavage structure. And notice, for them, although the first period, the really early period, it was different, now it's this high income and low income and low education folks who are Democrats, and high income and high education people who are Republicans. So the cleavages are still these sloping diagonal lines like that. That's the end. Thank you. Questions? I think, do we have a mic for questions? Thank you. Should we just go out into the audience?
Could be passed, yeah, it depends.
Okay.
Thank you. Gotta be some questions. Walter, thank you.
So I thought I heard you say that age wasn't important, but I just saw on Rachel Maddow where all the millennials are 74% or some high number against Trump. So, and especially thinking about the change over time, it's probably important to think about the changing, because those people presumably become older people. And so what do you really think about when age is factored into this? What's going to happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Walter said that on Rachel Maddow, the source of all information, that my wife watches it religiously, but she also watches Fox News, actually, because she should get both sides. Although, anyway, it's pretty frustrating to watch Fox News. She was saying that a lot of millennials are against Trump. I did some runs where I actually included age, and I didn't get much effect, but I'll be truthful, I haven't done much analysis of that, and more needs to be done. And maybe age will be a useful thing too. I would say, though, that to liberals or Democrats in the audience, don't assume that the growing fraction of the electorate that's not white non-Hispanics, that's going to solve the problem, and don't assume that millennials are going to solve the problem, because I think it's a pretty deep problem that Democrats have, and I don't know that they have good policies, and this was part of Hillary Clinton's problem, that she never talked about economic policies. She mostly talked about issues that, frankly, were going to drive away pieces of her coalition that she needed, I think. Yeah.
At the last
Let's wait for the microphone.
Oh, thank you. At the last two American Political Science Association annual meetings, Ron Engelhardt and Pippa Norris did analysis focused on education as the SES type variable, and their so Engelhardt type post-materialism as the attitudinal variable. And their results basically mirror yours, even though they're using completely different indicators. They come up with a similar story that the Trump people are anti-education, and that there's been a big change in the political structure that's populist-driven. So it's interesting that there seems to be some sort of latent convergence of the two approaches, but you might want to speak to that a little bit.
I would like to look at that, yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, that's very useful.
I guess what seems most different from the conventional wisdom, at least to those of us who aren't in political science, maybe all of you already knew this, but the big surprise here to me was this high income relative to education being sort of the largest Trump group, because we think of it as, I mean, conventional wisdom, I think, the Rachel Maddow conventional wisdom maybe, is that it's the people who've lost their jobs, the people in, I'm pretty sure that, the maps make it pretty clear that it is those areas that went for Trump. So have we been missing something about it? That it's not actually those people who lost their jobs, it's their cousins or their parents, or?
I think it's more than the people who have lost their jobs, from my analysis. That's where I need to go into looking more at urbanism and region and even area to try to get a better sense of what's going on. But my strong sense is it's not just folks who have lost their jobs. Although it is people who are really worried about the future in a society that they think increasingly requires higher education. They haven't gotten it. They're worried their kids won't be able to get it. And as a result, they feel resentment towards the system and feel that somebody like Trump maybe can help them. Okay.
The fact may be too fleeting, but what about the influence of all of the organizational efforts that are going on, like the women, the young, very young adults, and they're tied with the millennials, and there's a kind of slowly building union organization that's occurring. Is that going to have any effect?
I think it will have some effect, but I also believe that the Democrats are experiencing fundamental structural problems they need to take into account. I've been talking to some people, since I'm the dean of a public policy school, about helping to do some evaluations of some new programs that have to do with a guaranteed universal income, or the one I prefer actually, which is a guaranteed job, whatever that means. There has been an NES question for decades that asked about guaranteed jobs, government guaranteed jobs. I like the latter, by the way, because I don't think just giving money to people is a good idea. I think a job is too important to your basic self-identity, and if you're going to do anything to help folks, you need to make sure you don't undermine their basic identity. But now there's at least some policy ideas, and I think that's what the Democrats need, and that's what, again, I don't think Hillary Clinton had. I mean, there was just nothing where you could say, oh, she's proposing this. Now, a place marker for this is the notion of having tuition-free college. But again, as an academic administrator, I think that's a terrible idea because first, I don't think we can afford it, and so it's not going to happen. And second of all, if we did require that, I don't know how a university like Michigan or Berkeley is able to do that without essentially adulterating what we're doing in a fundamental way. And by the way, I'm not sure that I want to give free college education to the children of rich people. In fact, what I want to do is have them pay tuition and then give that money back to people who are of lower income.
When you started, I was suddenly transported back to 1940 or 1948, and I thought you were Bernard Berelson,
Yeah.
Who famously proclaimed political preferences arise from sociological characteristics, or something like that. And I wondered if you could bring me back to 2016 and tell me how your theory of sociological characteristics differs from what the Columbia School was teaching us a long time ago.
I always thought that was a great set of efforts complementary to what had happened at Michigan. And Michigan focused a lot on the attitudinal issue items, and that I thought that the Berelson et al. Folks, Lazarsfeld, had focused on sociological things. I think it's actually stuff in between we need to look at more, which is groups that are defined partly by their sociological characteristics, but also by the groups they belong to. So I'm interested in looking at not just religious attenders, but exactly what churches they go to, and trying to understand more.
That's what Berelson did.
Yeah.
Interested in exactly what church.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure this is innovation so much as repetition.
Oh, no, it is different. Would you like me to tell you why?
Oh, this is great. Thank you, please.
In 1960, when the American Order was being written, Warren Miller said about the Columbia people is that they were unable to talk about change. They only had sociological characteristics that arose again and again in a repetitive way, and that the vote swings were something that they couldn't touch, which is where attitude came in. But part of your talk was about sociological characteristics, and I'm still wondering what the underlying theory there is.
Well, I think the underlying theory is stuff in the book that I wrote with Richard Johnston and other co-authors on letting the people decide. We make the argument that, in fact, a large part of politics is about issue entrepreneurs coming up with issues and then appealing to electorates, and that's appealing often to their sociological characteristics one way or another, and that when people are successful, like with the abortion issue, and Richard Nixon and others after him, Ronald Reagan and so forth, that changes the nature of politics. So it's the interaction of the sociological characteristics with issue entrepreneurs and the fact that issues can mobilize people of different kinds of backgrounds and sociological characteristics. So maybe that's the answer. Thank you.
Well,
You've made me think.
I'm actually going to build on that then, I think, which is I was very interested when, you know, that this was sort of largely framed sociologically, and then all of a sudden sort of the reason the economic arguments weren't appealing to lower income individuals was because of race, right? Or because, and that's not a racial effect per se, right? It's clearly a racial perception that gets built on there, and I'm wondering if you can expound a bit on how you think that interaction operates in that case in particular, because that's clearly a crux of why the Democratic Party is doing what it's doing right now, successfully or unsuccessfully.
Well, and I think it's also some other identity issues. I mean, think about somebody in middle America who, I mean, the Obama administration.
Middle America.
Ann Arbor is not middle America. I will go through a bit of it. Thank you. So, yes, thank you, Don. But anyway, so now I've forgotten what I was going to say. But so yeah.
The racial.
Right. Think of somebody in, yeah, it's not just racial, I think. Think of somebody in not in Ann Arbor, who lives in middle America, who sees gender-neutral bathrooms, for example. And they just look at that and they go, why do I have to change where I go to the bathroom because there's a small group of people, and it is a small group of people. I'm in favor of this, by the way. I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea here. I'm building a new building in Berkeley, and it will have gender-neutral bathrooms. But I just think about how they must look at that and say, I'm going to be bothered for the very small fraction of the population. And furthermore, the Obama administration thought that just before an election, the most important thing they could do was to come forward with this policy. That looks wrong-headed to a lot of folks. And I think politically it was wrong-headed. And so it's not just race, but it is race as well. And I think, you know, we all know the literature of people like Marty Gillens and many others who have shown how the average welfare recipient gets pictured in the media as being African-American, when in fact the average is not African-American, it's a white person, and on and on. And so that immediately when you have programs that are income redistribution or welfare or Obamacare, the person who ends up in the news and discussed by people like Ronald Reagan are welfare queens who are black in the way he describes them, and so forth and so on. So that's how it gets mixed up, it seems to me. That redistributional kinds of schemes immediately bring in visions in the minds of white non-Hispanics of black people, and then the historic original sin of America kicks in.
Question for you. You use the term issue entrepreneurs. The stuff that you've seen, do you see any evidence of issue entrepreneurs emerging from what you're seeing now with these changes and what have you? Are there any out there on either side?
Well, Donald Trump is an issue entrepreneur. He's done brilliantly with the free trade issue. He's just played that absolutely brilliantly and claimed that by striking harder deals, by rejecting trade agreements, he's going to bring lots of jobs back to America, and this sounds very good to the folks I've been talking about, it seems to me. I think there's definitely issue entrepreneurs. I think one of the big questions about Donald Trump, by the way, is there's 3 ways you really have an impact as a president. One is you cause a political realignment, and I'm just not sure that's going to happen, although I show that, in fact, over time it has been happening, but I don't know that Donald Trump is the cause of what's been happening. He's a symptom of it. So it's not clear he's going to create a new realignment. The second way is you have new ideas and ideologies and perspectives, and he's got some ideas, but I don't think they're coherent enough and that they're not going to be something that's really going to persist. And the third way you change the presidency is you change the way it operates. There he's going to have a big impact, I fear, and that we're going to have a presidencies in the future that look more like Donald Trump and less like Barack Obama, which to me is a great sadness.
I was going to ask whether you think.
use them.
I was going to ask whether you think 2016 is.
Yeah, I think this change has been occurring over time, so it's hard to say it's 2016. And I think it remains to be seen, and it depends upon what the Democrats can do. If they can get, I mean, this though is, I'm going the wrong way. This is rather remarkable, just an enormous amount of movement here. And if this persists, cleavage moving that much, you might start saying that looks like a realigning election.
Henry, if you compare 2016 to the Obama elections, is there still a connection?
I haven't done that. That's a good question. You know, in other words, breaking out the Obama election.
2000, 2004 are different.
Yeah.
Kind from
Yeah. That's a good question,
from the Obama
to which I don't have an answer. Yeah. Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question about methodology. At
Sure.
one point, you pointed out how the frequency of religious attendance measure in the ANS study wasn't as good as the GSS one. I'll invoke God at the moment. As a graduate student here, when Phil was here, one of the things I remember him saying was, don't change the question,
Right.
even if it improves the measure.
Right.
Are you ready to challenge God?
Well, actually, the question has been changed twice. And in fact, the original question up to about 1980 was one about, are you regular or not regular? And then it asked questions about weekly or not weekly, and then I can't remember the third change. One reason I went to the GSS was because I feared that the changes in the question wording in the NES was the cause of the result I showed with respect to the religious realignment. And the neat thing is you find that with a question that really has stayed the same since 1972 in the GSS when it started, you get exactly the same result as you get in the ANES. So the question, even with changes in the ANES, has actually captured what's going on mostly. And it's actually, by the way, a 5-point item now, but it's still, I wish it had 8 or whatever the GSS has, because I think that's very useful. I would not change the question probably, if you want to ask me. Fundamentally, I would not for the reason you suggested.
So I wanted to get some more clarity on your thinking about where race falls in the sort of order of these causes for, say, the Trump vote or these various lines that we see here. So, and thinking about the sociological factors that you talked about, it seems like race is not an afterthought to them, but it falls maybe third in the order that you're thinking about. And so I'm just trying to get a greater sense on what your thinking is about what's the sort of proximate cause of this? Is it primarily race and these sociological factors that you talk about sort of secondary to that, or is it sort of reversed?
Well, there's 2 places where race comes in here, because eventually I separate out the 2 data sets. And one thing is that the non-white Hispanic group is just behaving differently. So it's clearly all the changes with respect to education is occurring among white non-Hispanics. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second question is why is it happening? And there race enters again. And I would argue that race is important, but I'm not sure it's the only thing. I think it's things like gender-neutral bathrooms, as I say, and it's abortion. There's evidence that, for example, as I said, there's evidence that conservative fundamentalist churches preach a gospel of self-reliance, and that causes fundamentalist Christians of low income to be more conservative economically than they would otherwise be. And I don't think that has a lot directly to do with race. I mean, there may be overtones of it, but I don't think it's directly about race. So race is important. I mean, race isn't, I mean, the major things in American politics you have to understand are race and religion, I think. And then third class.
Henry, I just was going to give you one other piece of validating data in terms of the stuff you've seen. Not that you need it, but on the question of the religious cleavages, if you look because of the changes in the church attendance item and so forth, if you look at other kinds of things in the ANES, for example, the biblical literalism item, you get it goes back to 92,
Yeah, unfortunately, that question's not been answered. I think it was 84 that this is the Bible, everything in it is true, versus it's just a good book.
If that shows an even steeper rise,
Right.
And bigger rise. That it was actually as recently as '92, early '90s. If you subtracted the Democratic vote share from the Republican vote share, it was 0 among people who were biblical literalists at that time, and that in 2016, it's like 60 percentage points. It's huge.
So that's a better question. Unfortunately, it hasn't been asked
But it's-
long
yeah,
enough, period, which is too bad, because it's a fabulous question. And by the way, it's a question that's important to tell your students about, because they are always surprised when I tell them that about a third of the American population believe that the Bible is the Word of God and that every word and thought in it is true. And they just can't believe that. I mean, this is Berkeley, I admit. I bet it's true in Ann Arbor, too.
The reason why those questions got on late is because the National Election Study Board, they didn't know anything about
I agree with you.
religion. And I know this because I am one. And it's every day.
Good.
We had to bring somebody in from Notre Dame to change the study.
Well, when we did the Voice and Equality study, Sid Verba, Kay Schlossman, and me, I'm working with two lovely people, they're both Jewish, and I kept fighting for the notion we've got to include a whole bunch of stuff about religion, and they said, well, why? And luckily we did it, and it turns out, I think one of the great strengths of that book is we point out the importance of religion in American politics. But I spent a year at a theological seminary, so, I know a little bit about religion.
I really enjoyed your data analysis. I think it's very good. I wonder if you could tie it to the concept of populism, which was part of
Right.
the title.
Well, populism is one of those concepts that it's like a droplet of mercury. You don't necessarily easily put your finger on it. And so it's hard to know exactly what it is. I think actually populism is very much encapsulated in the notion of people whose income is a little higher than their education. And that therefore their notions are not as articulated and deep and profound about how the world works. And they feel a bit of resentment because they feel like they've had to work so hard to get where they are, and those educated people, they seem to just get education and get government guaranteed jobs, and so on and so forth. So that's the best I can do. There's whole books on this trying to explain it. And of course, there's left-wing and right-wing populism. One of the interesting things, actually I think I have it here, is maybe that's not even the best one. This one. Yeah, attitudes towards economic issues. Is it harder to succeed now than in the past? And so down at the bottom we have Sanders on the left, Clinton, the Republican governors who ran, Rubio, Carson, Cruz, and Trump. And notice the U-shaped figure. The Sanders voters and the Trump voters are in the same place. They think it's harder to get ahead in America than it used to be. They think their children are not going to be as well off as they are. And that's, I think, a very big piece of populism right now, of the left and the right.
I can follow up a little bit on the notion of populism. Let me see if I can explain it. That is that the white working class was migrating out of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party didn't notice it.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right. There is some personal relationship. There's Tom Watson, for example, famous governor of Georgia. His famous thing was that he initially was somebody who was trying to organize poor people, black and white, and then realized that wasn't getting him anywhere, and he became a virulent racist. And so started out as a left populist and ended up as a right populist. One of the most famous, it's a great book about him, Tom Watson, Agrarian Rebel. George Wallace is another one, who went in the opposite direction, actually.
Henry, also really fascinating stuff. And I know you said you were going to get to this next, but have you looked at just the simple difference between Catholics who go to church a lot and fundamentalist Protestants who go to church a lot, and do you see a convergence there over time?
That's
that what you're showing?
Good question. No, is the answer. I have not looked at it, no. But it's a really good question. So
I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask you a question. You had
Ron's got one here too, I think. Did you?
You had attitudes about higher education at the beginning of your talk. Did you make that connection?
Well, I think that part of what we're seeing in the Republican Party now is there's a group of people there who feel that education is not that important because they made it without it, and furthermore, they're not sure that their children will have the access to education that they need. So there's sort of two, in some ways, conflicting things. On the one hand, they want it. On the other hand, they say, well, you don't really need it. And therefore, they end up with opinions like I showed you, which is that they don't trust higher education to be very helpful to them or to their kids. And I think that's a worrisome thing in America for public institutions like ourselves. I mean, we're besieged enough by budgetary problems in every state in which healthcare, corrections, K through 12 are much more important than we are. We're about fourth or fifth down the list. And now to add on top of that, this populist dislike of us is very, very worrisome. We really see this in California right now.
Thank you, Henry. This was a great talk. A couple of things. First, populism is about a mass...
This is a historian, so he knows this stuff.
and not of America.
Okay, right.
So it's a mass movement that somehow is mobilized against some imaginary or real elite, right? So it's always that.
Right.
And resentment is a dominant emotion here that you mentioned. But I want to suggest something else, another emotion, and that's anxiety. That is fear without an actual object or an imagined object.
Right.
And the reason I bring that up is because as a Europeanist, as someone who studies the Soviet Union and Turkey and Hungary and Poland and God knows what, you know,
Places where interesting stuff is happening.
This stuff is happening everywhere.
Yeah.
So there's something more global here
Right.
than just America. I mean, obviously you got to start with where you live and do that. And I wonder if the kinds of anxieties that people have, you might call it modernity, you might call it capitalism, because there are essentially no alternatives to capitalism right now, the kinds of unpredictability. I think about my own place, that is, place I studied, the Soviet Union, which was the most predictable society. You knew where it was going to happen, you knew who was going to get educated, you knew you had a pension, all of that's gone. And you look for some haven in a heartless world, a harbor, and that leads to places like religion, family, nation, those kinds of hard identities. Would that be something? How would you get to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think it needs exploration, and I think it's sort of, certainly this evidence is consistent with something like that. I don't think it's inconsistent at all. So whether exactly those are the mechanisms, I don't know. This is a case where some really good qualitative studies are worthwhile. There are a few, but anyway, this is what I do. I do data. Even though I write about the importance of qualitative research, I really mostly do data.
Hi. So with this idea of religiosity kind of shifting people towards republicanism and thinking about the 2016 election, if it is the case that religion leads to higher conservatism on moral issues, and then you have a candidate like Trump that has such a variability on morality.
That's a nice way to, variability on morality. I like that. That's a very good phrase.
So, my question is, are we seeing an era which is less about religious conservatism and more that religious conservatism in some Christian specific ways is a proxy for intolerance? That there's some sort of breeding of intolerance that is partnered with some kind of Christian fundamentalism that is sort of what we're seeing with someone like Trump, where it's the intolerance and the closeness that's causing it rather than some high moral religious standard of behavior.
I mean, I think that's a good point. I might put it slightly differently. I think it's leading to a fundamentalist Christian perspective that's very nationalist, where identity as American really matters. And of course, that leads very quickly perhaps to intolerance with respect to those who are not Americans by their definition. And, even though, crazy to call African Americans not Americans, they're every bit as American as white people, and in fact more American than many white people who came here much later than many of the African Americans, but nevertheless it's the other that it gets translated into. Sadly, some of that's going on. And again, it'd be great to have people who are ethnographers and students of those churches to get a better sense of what's being said in the pulpits. And my guess is that in the pulpits of some of those churches, you're hearing things that are close to some of the concerns you have.
Right. I want to thank Henry for this great talk. And
Thank you.